Well, good evening, everyone. It's great to see you. Carrying on in this the last chapter of 2 Samuel. If you're not too clear on the Bible, this is in a section of the Bible called the history books. We've got 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, and then we've got the Chronicles. And 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, it's a big chunk of history. It doesn't look like it, but this chapter is really nearing the end of David's life in the way it's constructed in the story. The next verse, from the end verse that we've read here in the story, it talks about David being very old, being in bed, and he can't keep warm. There's only one other act that is recorded for us in the life of David, which is making Solomon, his son, king. Solomon was the second born to Bathsheba. If you take the story back and you remember the story of Bathsheba and David, one of the worst, most awful, saddest events in the storyline of David, and yet it's Solomon, Bathsheba's son, who becomes king. It's pretty extraordinary, isn't it? So it doesn't look like it, but what I want to really focus on tonight is the idea that this is the end of David's life. We're nearing the end. Every time we go to that idea of nearing the end, I can't help it, but Frank Sinatra jumps into my brain. And now the end is near, and so I face the final curtain. My friend, I'll say it clear, I'll state my case of which I'm certain. I've lived a life that's full. David could have said that. I've traveled each and every highway, but much more than this, I did it my way. I think that is one of the most tragic verses penned in the history of the human race, because it captures the very essence of our desperate desire to make life something, to know that there is an end, and that the only thing we can fall back on without God is that we did it our way. It's tragic. What does faith look like? And how can this account of David speak to us? How can the Bible narrative speak to us about what we're doing now in our lives to live a life which, when we get to that final curtain, we get to that point and we say and we sing something different. Paul, in 2 Timothy chapter 4, he didn't write it as a song, but it captures a whole load of the same sentiment. He says this: "For I'm already being poured out like a drink offering, and the time for my departure is near." See the parallel? See the contrast? I've fought the good fight. I've finished the race. I've kept the faith. Now, there is in store for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award me on that day, and not only to me, but also to all who have longed for his appearance. This whole series has been centering around the idea of who do you think you are? And contained in that is Paul's deep confidence in his identity, that who I am is somebody who at the end, when the curtain falls, is not disappearing off looking backwards, hoping that I can say that my life was worth living. It is still somebody looking forwards, saying there is a crown of righteousness to be placed on my head. And it is going to be given to me by somebody who is the greatest judge in all of the cosmos, the one who has the right to place that on my head. How have I achieved it? How have I got to the point when the curtain is closing that I can say that I can have that crown? Because I fought the good fight, I've finished the race, and I've kept the faith. Keeping the faith, I think, is one of the most emotionally charged ideas in our experience if we believe and trust and seek to follow God. The idea of keeping the faith. Who do we think we are? Do we think we are someone who keeps the faith? In fact, what does keeping the faith look like? Because this chapter, I think, has masses to speak into. In fact, as you probably hear me say this virtually every time, this is one of the most amazing theology-packed chapters in the narrative of David. It is incredible when we start to peel back some of the layers. I want us to ask, can we move from the idea of who we think we are to being able to know who we are? So that we can say, I might think I'm that, but there is an alternative knowledge which tells me I know I'm something else. Can we learn from David? The chapter is really straightforward. It's long, but it's pretty straightforward. Here's how it goes. Nine steps. And that's not a 10-minute point for each step, by the way. 9 steps, David takes the census. Step 2, 9 months of data collection. That's pretty amazing, isn't it? Google in the 700 years before Jesus, data collection is 9 months of going around finding out all of the fighting men. At the end of that, David confesses, and then he's given a choice of punishment. We're going to look at that. David throws himself on God's wisdom for the choice. A plague falls. David stands in the gap. David sacrifices and pays the price. And sacrifice brings the end of the plague. That's the 9 steps. Anybody who wants those steps, give me a shout afterwards. More than happy to give you those steps if you want to read it later on. First thing that we see then is David takes a census. But there is already something way deeper about this census. And it wraps into our brains this complex idea of a complete mystery. How do we reconcile God's purposes and our actions? Look at what it says. Again, in verse 1, again, the anger of the Lord burned against Israel. If you've read all of the previous history of Israel, right the way from the point where they left Egypt, what you see is this cycle repeating itself again and again. Israel behaves in a way which is not reflective of who they truly are, and God is angry with them. And it causes a response. Again, the anger of the Lord burns against Israel. What is the response in this case? He incited David against them, saying, go and take a census of Israel and Judah. Isn't that kind of, doesn't that mess with you trying to work out how does this work? What I do know is that behind it all is God's hand. And at the same time, there is a response in David, which is that he behaves in a way which is to take a census. He's behaved in a way which the people will pay a price for further on down the line. But the narrator starts the chapter by helping us to understand the way the plague unfolds, the way the judgment unfolds, starts with the first sentence, which is, the anger of the Lord be burned against Israel. That's where it starts. We love to talk about God. We love even more post-Jesus to talk about God through Jesus. We love that. We love to talk about his love, but what we find in 21st century Western thinking is it is incredibly difficult to talk about God as a God of wrath and justice. We find it really difficult to talk about that because I think it's this. I think the challenge of talking about God like that is we want to defend God. We want people to love God. We want people to love Jesus. We want to make sure that we shine the light on all the best bits we think about God. Look at God. Isn't he beautiful? He's loving. He's kind. He's amazing. We don't emphasize another side of God, which is a God of wrath and justice. And actually, when we look around at profound injustice in the world, we need a God who is going to judge against those very acts. We need a God who hates that more than we hate it. But we don't shine a light on that because we want to make God really lovely and cutesy. Saw a brilliant little interview with Alice Cooper. It was doing the rounds on social media in the past few weeks. Alice Cooper, some of you won't have a clue who Alice Cooper is. Some of you are old enough to kind of enjoy Alice Cooper. Some of you are old enough actually to remember when you dressed like Alice Cooper. Alice Cooper, the king of darkness, kind of goth rock god, he said this. Did you know he was a believer in Jesus? A deep believer in Jesus. He says this. A lot of people say I came to Christ because of my love for Jesus. I came to Christ because of my fear of God. I totally understood that hell was not getting high with Jim Morrison. Hell was going to be the worst place ever. In fear, I came back to the Lord. And then he says, and this is the amazing bit, then he says, that's how I came back. And then I went to a church that preached about the love of God. And then he says, the two coming together is the most amazing insight into the nature of God. What we see here is a living reality of the justice of God, which I think will unfold as we go along. Because what happens is David sends his men out. We see Joab here, actually. Joab the kind of, he's an antagonist in all sorts of bad and good ways. In this moment, he says, do you know what? You are amazing, king, but you sure you really want to do this? Yeah, carry on, crack on, go and count the troops. Look at verse 10. When he comes back, gives the numbers, 800,000, 500,000, 1.3 million fighting men in all of Israel and Judah. That is an incredible army. And David was conscience-stricken after he had counted the fighting men, and he said to the Lord, I've sinned greatly in what I've done. Now, Lord, I beg you, take away the guilt of your servant. I have done a very foolish thing. It's not explicit what the sin of David is, but I'm pretty sure it's something like this. David, who has been the servant of God as the king of God's people, the shepherd of God's people, decides, I want to know how great we are. He'd lost sight of how great God is, and he wanted to know the number that tells me how great we are. And I think when the number came back, which is just an overwhelming number of huge success from a people who are a ragtag bunch who leave Egypt, I think when David is confronted with the number of the greatness of the people of God, he is slaughtered in his conscience. It's almost as though the good news, when you've taken it to yourself and you realize I'm going to take this, and then you realize it is nothing about me. He realized deeply how much he'd wanted it to be about him. And yet, and this is faith. What does David do with that conscience? He gets the number back. Where does he go with the guilt? He goes back to God. Look at what I've done. I've sinned greatly in what I've done. If there's almost a mantra over David in his life, it's him coming back saying, I've sinned greatly in what I've done. Psalm 51, we looked at it last time I was speaking. Against you and you only have I sinned and done this evil in your sight. I've done this great evil again in your sight. That is faith. That is faith. It is the ability to know the nature of God and to be able to come back again and again and again. You see, when Paul says, I've run the race, I've finished the course, I've kept the faith, what does he mean? Does he mean I look back over my life and I've been able to champion good work right the way through it? Actually, Paul, in another part, he writes in Romans, the depths of his heart tells me everything that I try to do that is good, I find I can't do, and everything that I don't want to do that I know is evil, I find that I am inclined to do that. It's as though Paul and David sit alongside each other and they say, I look back over my life and I realize what I continually want to do is not what you want me to do. I want to do it my way, in the words of Frank. But what he finds is both David and Paul are drawn back to confess that sin again and again. They know the nature of God. They know what God is like. So faith is not living good lives. Faith is the absolute confidence that when it all falls apart, I can come back again. So when Paul and David, the last, isn't it incredible? The last thing that I am sure that after this, David did some good stuff in his life as king. I'm sure he must have done some good stuff in his life after this. But the narrator of Samuel wants the last incident in David's life to be a failure. The Bible doesn't whitewash the people of God. It tells them in their reality, and it says this is what he is like, but in that he comes back. I want to encourage you what faith is. It's the ability to come back. Our identity is that we can come back. When we know the reality of that grappling of, I want to do this, I can't do it, I don't want to do that, I find I do it, just as Paul says, we think that our identity, therefore, is somebody who's kind of crawling around in the filth of the reality of our hearts. And yet what we see is the ability to come back, which says, no, you are righteous. Not because you've learned how to do only good things, but because you trust me to come back. That is faith. Having said that, there is the impact of guilt. There is the impact of what David does. Look at the verse 12 and 13. After David has confessed, this is verse 12, go and tell David this is what the Lord says. After his confession, Gad comes to him. I'm giving you 3 options. Choose one of them for me to carry out against you. So Gad went to David and said to him, shall there come on you 3 years of famine in the land, or 3 months of fleeing from your enemies while they pursue you, or 3 days of plague in your land? Now then, think it over and decide how I should answer the one who sent me. Is this some kind of divine tormentor? It's kind of the worst idea. Choose the way you want to die. Kind of wrapped up in Shakespeare, isn't it? The kind of the worst of ideas. How do you want to die as a result of what you've done? David acts in faith again. Here's faith. David didn't. You see, what David didn't do, and he's got time to do it, clearly. He can think it over. What do you want to do? David didn't sort of walk away from Gad and think, okay, if I calculate it up, 3 days of plague doesn't sound too bad. Or a few years of being pursued, a few months of being pursued doesn't sound too bad. Or a few years of famine, we can get through that. Let's score it out. Let's stick it into an Excel spreadsheet. Let's weight all of the ideas. Let's see which is the biggest impact on us. His faith is this. David said to Gad in verse 14, I am in deep distress. Let us fall into the hands of the Lord, for his mercy is great, but don't let me fall into human hands. You see, in this failure, David is again and again and again living out faith. It's pretty amazing what he does. God sent the plague on them. Which is the act of David, the thing that he wanted to do, brings profound suffering on the whole of the people. I mean, talk about the responsibility of leadership. Talk about what it means to be a people. It's kind of a chicken and egg. You know, you kind of get the leaders that you want, and the leaders get what they want. It is such a mess. The people deserve the judgment of God, but it is David's actions which causes a plague to fall on the land. What stops it? What breaks into this, and what stops the terror? When David, look at verse 17. When David saw the angel who was striking down the people, he said to the Lord, I have sinned. I, the shepherd, have done wrong. These are but sheep. What have they done? Let your hand fall on me and my family. How incredible that statement there. What happens after that? David goes to the threshing floor of Araunah in verse 24. He can see, it's almost as though the way the narrator is picturing this, he's almost seeing the plague sort of washing out across the land. It's getting to the threshing floor of Araunah. The amazing thing here is Araunah is a Jebusite. He's outside of God's people. David goes to his threshing floor. He's one of the Canaanites still living in the land. I mean, actually, you would think, well, if a plague is going to kind of pour out all over the place. The last thing that God's going to be concerned about, and the last thing that David is going to be concerned about, is a Jebusite. And yet God allows the threshing floor of Araunah to be the point where it stops. How does it stop? Verse 24. Araunah says, you want to buy my threshing floor and sacrifice? Here's everything you need. You can have it. You can have all the wood. My implements, my tools, burn them. Here's the ox, burn them. Sacrifice here, I'll give you everything. The king replied to Araunah, no, I insist on paying for it. For I will not sacrifice to the Lord my God burnt offerings that cost me nothing. See what David is saying? He could have said, I see that it is actually the guilt of the people that has brought this, and I am willing to share in that with you. And he says, no, I'm going to stand at this point, and he says what? I am going to bear the price. I am going to take the cost on me. You're not going to give it to me. I'm going to pay you it. And there, at that point, a non-Jew gets saved because of the sacrifice of the king. See, this whole chapter, it's almost as though the narrator wants David in his final acts to sing out the very reason why you and I can keep coming back. Because this chapter is actually almost a dramatic, huge play writ large of the gospel. The king stands with his people, and the guilt of the people causes the king to bear the guilt as well. How does he bear the guilt? We read it earlier. He says, I'm the shepherd. I'm the shepherd. I'm the one who is called. These are only the sheep. Don't blame them. But we know from the first verse that it is exactly the behavior of the sheep that has brought the judgment. And David says, no, I'm the shepherd. Don't slaughter the sheep. Let me bear it. Let me bear the guilt. Does that sound familiar? I mean, it's like the narrator of Samuel is wanting to shout Jesus, the shepherd who bears the guilt for the sheep who are actually guilty. He brings a sacrifice, and everything stops when the sacrifice is made. The guilty are saved, the sacrifice is made, the shepherd bears the price. Those who are outside of Israel and Judah, Araunah, are also recipients of that grace. And everything there embodies Jesus. It's almost as though I want to prepare you. I know it's not for 750 years, but you need to be ready for Jesus. This is what it looks like. And this is why you and I can keep coming back. It's why we can keep coming back. It's why faith looks like the ability to come back. It's the ability to constantly return and confess. You see, what we see in the Old Testament is this constant cycle of guilt, judgment, confession, guilt, judgment, confession, and it's all preparing us for a moment where one sacrifice replaces the cycle. And then we are able to say, like Paul, my true identity is not what I think I am, which is this messed up wreck who keeps on screwing things up and making a complete disaster time and again. Yeah, make a little bit of progress and then I think and do and behave and have an attitude which takes me back and a step forward a little bit more because I can come back and confess. And justice doesn't immediately fall on me. Why is that? Because justice has fallen once on the shepherd who has paid the price. And if I keep coming back, it is a sign that I am keeping the faith. Do not think that the mark of keeping the faith is now doing only good. The mark of keeping the faith is that we can keep coming back. Because the cycle has been broken, the shepherd has borne the pain, the shepherd has paid the price, the sacrifice has been made, and therefore we are now truly able to sing every year, once in royal David's city stood a lowly cattle shed, where a mother laid her baby. Jesus, who has been proclaimed to shepherds and who comes once to pay the price. I think David could have sung our last song as he reflected back. I'm convinced that David was able to come back because he could sing what we're about to sing, that he knows of the goodness of God.